Hello, everybody. Good evening to South Carolina. I am Tameika Isaac Devine, former city councilwoman here in the city of Columbia, a mom, a parent of public education students here in South Carolina, and I'm super excited to be sitting down tonight with our candidate for State Superintendent of Education, Lisa Ellis. Please, if you're watching us live on Facebook or Twitter, please share this so that more people can listen. And so, team, we're ready to go. Good evening again to everybody, and welcome to this virtual town hall for Lisa Ellis for Superintendent of Education for here in South Carolina. I'm Tameika Isaac Devine, former city councilwoman here in the city of Columbia, a parent of public school children here in South Carolina, a community advocate, and most important, an engaged voter. And so we're so excited to have you here. Y'all, every single election is important, but every year we have a race that is a generational change race. And the superintendent of education race here in the state of South Carolina is such a race. We have an amazing candidate who has been in the trenches and has been working for us in the classroom for many years. And now she has offered herself for a candidate for state superintendent of education. And like me, as a parent of school-age kids, it is so important that we have a policymaker who understands the classroom and understands how do we improve at public education here in the state of South Carolina, not just even if you have children in the state in public schools, but as a citizen of South Carolina, our education system is critical to the growth of our great state. And so we have this town hall. I know a lot of folks have been trying to figure out, how do they find out about the candidates. So we're going to give you that opportunity here today. And so, Lisa, thank you so much because you're actually still working in the classrooms as you're campaigning, aren't you?
I am. Tameika, thank you so much for being willing to host this tonight. I am still in the school, in the classroom. And I was joking with some teachers today that we feel like this week has lasted 400 years. So it has been a long week. And my students, I think so too. They were like, yeah, tomorrow for the game. And we all paused. We're like, wait, it's just Wednesday. We've still got 2 more days of this. So
Well, we thank you for what you do for our kids, and we thank you for offering yourself as a candidate. So let's just really jump in to questions. And so for those of you who are watching, we have had questions already submitted by voters all across the state about what they want to know about Lisa and her platform. So I'm going to jump into those questions. And then, but if you have any additional questions, please feel free to put them in the comments or the chat. And if we have time, we're going to make sure that we get through them. We're going to go to right around 7-ish. And then if you, for some reason, if we don't get to all the questions, make sure that you engage with the campaign, and we'll make sure that you get answers to your questions. So my first question really is, Lisa, what has inspired you, number one, to be a teacher, to go into education, and then number two, to run for this office? Because as someone who's been a candidate myself, being a candidate is not easy. It is not something that people really willfully go into unless they're real passionate. So tell us about the inspiration for your career and for this race.
That's a great question. First, with my career, I just have always enjoyed working with children and later in students. I started babysitting when I was 12, 13. I worked at YMCA Camp Greenville as a camp counselor throughout college and a little bit after that. And I just really enjoyed being around children and watching them grow and learn and experience the world. And that sort of evolved into the opportunity to teach students and to be part of their growth process. I think often I think about legacy and what legacy we want to leave. And I think for me, part of that has been teaching and watching students grow and become really amazing adults that go on to live prosperous lives. So that to be a part of their story is really what motivates me to get up every day and go and teach and just watch them become the amazing human beings that they can. And really working in high school, you get to see that growth really well from the time they're in 9th grade through 12th grade. And then I love seeing them come back and say, I'm a dentist now, I'm a teacher, I'm a, this, I'm a that. It just really is wonderful to be a part of their lives. The second question about why I decided to run for office, I really have to say that I went kicking and screaming into it. I was trying to find other candidates to run because I love my job so much. I wasn't, really interested in leaving it, but I realized the crisis point that we're at with public education in South Carolina, particularly with the teacher shortage. And people kept saying no that I thought would be really great superintendents of education. And finally, at the end of February last year, I just thought, we've got to have a really great candidate. Our teachers and our students need somebody who has had the experience of still being in the classroom. And so I knew that if I didn't try, I would always regret it. And so I, threw my hat in and here we are. And it's one of those sort of bittersweet things where my campaign manager keeps saying to say, when I win, I really have the opportunity and hope to be able to affect policy on a much larger level in terms of bringing that teacher experience. But I really am going to, miss my students this year and, the next couple of years. So it's kind of a tough situation for me to be in because I don't really want to leave my job. But I know that we really need help in South Carolina in terms of education.
And that is great. And I think that inspiration, it means a lot. And I would say, I'd be remiss to say, I didn't say in the intro to you that you also are the founder of SC for Ed, which has really elevated the conversation as it relates to what teachers are dealing with in the classroom. I remember the very first year at the State House, and taking my then I think she was like in 4th grade then up there with me, and it was just the energy. But to me that goes to your passion for this. And a lot of folks will say, some people run for office because they want to have the fame, the glory, anything else, but you've actually been doing the work in the advocacy area, speaking up, trying to affect change at policy. And now that, there is an opportunity to affect change in a bigger way, you're going out there. So I love that. So do you see that kind of as an evolution and continuation of the work that you've done with SC for Ed?
I do. I still talk about 4 years ago, all I did was create a closed Facebook group. And it's one of those things where I have always considered myself a very behind the scenes person. I think, as teachers, we really, work to motivate and engage our students, and they're in the spotlight, and we sort of just, help them along. And particularly in my role now as student activities director, that's really how I see myself, as I'm in the behind the scenes and teaching the students and letting them be in the spotlight of all of this leadership and service. And that's sort of where SC for Ed came from. It was in having conversations with teachers and recognizing that, as I talk to teachers, just in my own schools, that we all were sort of dealing with the same issues. And we needed that community. And so that community, that closed Facebook group, turned into a grassroots advocacy movement to try and affect change. And it was a lot of learning on my part. I joke with people about the fact that I had to go back and watch the Schoolhouse Rocks, how a bill becomes a law, right? Because I hadn't paid attention in recent years, but just really in my own education policy, realized that I needed to learn this stuff or relearn it, because I had learned it in government class in high school. But then we also needed to really teach and educate other teachers as well, because you go in your classroom, you're living your life, you think that people are taking care of taking care of you in public education, at the policy standpoint. But what we've seen is that is not necessarily the truth. And so, in sort of helping educators understand, the power of their voice, the impact that they have not only on their students, but that they can have in the profession, and just moving sort of through that advocacy movement. You start out trying to understand, and then you become a little bit more vocal. And then I guess the natural movement is to, I don't know, is it a natural movement to run for office? Maybe not. But to me, that was the next piece of, I really want to make things better. I think that we need that school voice at this level to be able to not only have the conversations with policymakers, but to make sure that everybody understands the actual narrative of what is going on in schools, and not some of the rhetoric that we see coming out as, oh, this is really a problem, when it's not really a problem. And so part of my running for office is to reframe the narrative of, no, here's the actual problems that are in public education in South Carolina. I guess always that teaching piece of it, trying to educate others on what the issues really are.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And that's why we're doing this, because it's important that our voters are informed and they know, who the candidates are and what they stand for and what they'll do. So we've got some questions that have been submitted by voters throughout the state. And so I'm going to jump into those. The first one, Lisa, is, do you plan on getting rid of the recertification process and or the Read to Success initiative?
I think, well, that's a lot in that question. There has been legislation this last legislative cycle about removing the traditional recertification process for veteran teachers who have given 20 years of service. I fall into that area. And so I'm all for that, because in my opinion, if you have demonstrated 20 years of not only, of service in the profession, but of also, you have passed all of the pieces of it, your evaluations have been good. Yeah, you've hit that status of, you don't necessarily need to go through that traditional recertification process. You can still get your continuing ed credits, because we're all, as teachers, lifelong learners, and need to continue to stay up to date on new teaching trends, those sort of things. So we still need that professional development, but I don't think that we need to go through the same recertification process that those, who are newer to the profession need to. I think we have demonstrated our effectiveness in the classroom through our years of service. And if not, we're probably no longer in the classroom, to be honest with you. The Read to Succeed piece is another one that I have felt very strongly about, in the fact that I think that the idea of every student should be able to read by the third grade is absolutely fundamentally important, because we talk about, from K to second grade, students are learning to read, but then by third grade, they're reading to learn. At that point, the standards change, where the content is much more important at that point. But much like a lot of policy, the implementation of that law has really not been effective. For example, as a high school teacher, I'm expected to take a Read to Succeed class, that just one class, and I'm expected to pay for it and to complete it. And that's not going to help my students at all, because really by the time they get to me at the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th grade level, it's kind of too late for them to be able to to learn to read from me, because I don't know how to teach kids to read. And taking one class is not going to teach that. And so I think that we have we have created a system under Read to Succeed that really is not helping students learn to read. And so I would like for the Department of Ed to look at how they have interpreted that law and really reevaluate it, and really focus on the K through 12, or excuse me, the K through 2 level, again, where the learning to read is so important. I think that most of those teachers already know how to teach it. And the other piece of learning to read is one of the key concepts of that is making sure that class sizes are small, particularly at the K to 2 level. If a first grade teacher has 20, 25 students in their class, it's really difficult for them to be able to teach those students to read, because those students are coming in at all different levels. So I really think, we can't necessarily repeal the state law unless teachers just are up in arms about it and really fight for it. But I think we can look at the interpretation of it and make it a little bit more meaningful to where we're actually helping children learn to read.
I love that. And I'll give a little side note editorial to that. I think that goes to your answer is perfect in the fact that, we see the difficulty sometimes of getting legislation changed or passed in this state. But there's one thing about having a law, but there's also about the practice and the interpretation. And that is the critical role of this position, is that even if you have state laws that people don't necessarily agree with, your office will be in charge of helping the implementation so that it is easier, it does actually work, and it's effective. And so I think it's critical for voters to understand that, because sometimes people will hear things and they'll hear a candidate say one thing or another, but going back to, a Schoolhouse Rock, there are different branches of government and there are different roles, and the role that you're running for is critical on those things that you just talked about. So thank you so much for that very comprehensive answer. Appreciate that. So our next question to you is, are you prepared to reduce testing, especially in EC and primary grades? And for those watching, EC, early childhood, and primary grades.
Absolutely. One of the things that as a teacher in a school, not only when we think about testing, we think about sort of the end of the year, the high stakes, particularly in South Carolina in elementary schools, the SC Ready. But what people don't understand is how much testing goes into prepare for those high stakes testing, and to see where kids are. And particularly, in recent years, there has been a push to implement law about testing kindergartners, called the KRA, the Kindergarten Readiness Assessment. And, I just think that is a terrible idea, because it's done the first 2 weeks of school. So these, poor 5-year-olds come in, and the first 2 weeks they're having to sit down and test. And why you would start a child's educational journey with a test is beyond me. And again, the other piece of it is a lot of the tests are racially biased. They're experience biased in terms of, students have to have certain, or, to perform better when they have more valuable experiences in terms of seeing the world and those sort of things. And so, my goal is definitely to reduce testing. We've got to follow federal law, which the federal law currently is that students test in grades 3 through 8, and then in certain classes in high school. So we've got to follow that federal law until it changes. But the other piece about testing in South Carolina is that federal law is really general in how we assess students. We don't have to do high stakes testing. And so I think that we really, as the Department of Ed, need to reevaluate how we're testing in students and look at some of those more creative, relevant ways of assessing students. And then we really have to put pressure on school districts to stop testing at the district level. I'm talking about things like benchmarks to make sure that students are where they need to be. And the reality of that is a teacher can tell you if a student is where they need to be or not just by everyday interactions with that student. We don't need an official benchmark test to say, oh, this student is where they need to be, or this student is ahead, or this student is behind. Teachers know that. And so, that's one of the things that I think is becoming frustrating, really frustrating for teachers and students, but also parents are starting to realize how much testing is done. I think last year in December, I had the opportunity to speak at a school boards association conference, and I brought up the fact that we at that point had been in first semester 72 days, and 45 of those days, some group of students at my school had been tested. And so when we talk about academics, and we talk about, particularly with COVID, learning loss, the bigger issue is the amount of instructional time we're losing because of all of the testing from the district level to the state level, and of course, the federal level. So that's one of my top priorities, is to look at how much we're testing, and really to roll back as much as we can. Again, I've got to stick with federal and state law, but I think, again, there's the interpretation of what that looks like. And so the other piece of that, in terms of our state results and how we're testing, part of that is because of the type of test we're using. But the second part is that students are dealing with test fatigue. By the time you get to the test that counts, they've been tested so much that they're kind of like C, that sort of thing. And, we're just sort of tired. I actually have had the opportunity to speak to several elementary school students just over the campaign trail, and just say, hey, what are some things you think I should to work on if I make it into office? And all of their responses was, can you make it so we don't test as much? And to me, like, that point of view is what it's all about. If you're tired of testing and you're in the fourth or fifth grade level, there's a problem.
Absolutely. I'm going to take a break from the previously submitted questions, because we do have a question from someone who is watching, Donna Brown Newton, who is actually a candidate for SC House 80. So welcome, Donna, and thank you for running as well, and thank you for your question. So Lisa, her question is, would you consider using some of the lottery funds to increase teacher pay?
I think that's a great question, and that is one where I would have to do some research. I remember when the lottery, the education lottery, was implemented here in South Carolina, and K through 12, I was real excited, because I thought, oh, we're going to get some funding that is so needed. And the reality of the education lottery is that the bulk of it goes to college scholarships. And there's really a very small percentage of it that actually goes to K through 12 schools. And I'm not sure, I can't remember what percentage of that is, and where it specifically goes. I think one of the things with the lottery funding is that it's one of those sort of volatile accounts where you don't necessarily know how much is going to be in from time to time. But I do think, maybe it's an opportunity for us to supplement some of our K through 12 funding to help with, what we've already got. And then maybe that frees up some other money for teacher salaries. The other piece that I think we need to look at in terms of scholars or lottery money is looking at scholarships, particularly for those students who want to be teachers, or looking at ways for current teachers to maybe apply to have school student loans forgiven through that funding. And so, one of the things that we hear from particularly our new teachers is that they're having a hard time making ends meet because of their salary is so low. They've got the choice of moving out and living on their own, or paying their student loans down. So I think that, as we look at that education scholarship, the lottery fund, I think that we need to maybe spend more money on, creating scholarships for students who want to go into teaching, and then looking at loan forgiveness for teachers that are already in it. So that's sort of how I might address it And, I would have to, of course, do more research to figure out if that was a feasible thing to do with that money.
Awesome. Thank you. And for our listeners, I'll say again that we are taking your questions. So if you do have a question for State Superintendent of Education candidate Lisa Ellis, please put it in the comments in the chat, and we will definitely get to as many questions as we can in the time allowed. So our next question, actually, it really dovetails on that pay. But our next question was, what are your plans to increase teacher retention other than lowering the standards?
Well, I don't think that we need to lower the standards of teacher recruitment. I do think we need to remove some of the hoops that potential teachers need to jump through. For those of you who are in the education field, the praxis is a big hurdle that doesn't necessarily demonstrate whether or not a teacher is prepared to go into the classroom again. It's one of those high stakes tests that I think we need to reevaluate as a piece of that teacher certification. But as we travel to the state with SC for Ed, the two reasons that teachers give over and over again for leaving the classroom and leaving the job is salary and then working conditions. And so salary, of course, is something that, I would have to work with the General Assembly to raise, because that comes out of the appropriations bill or the budget bill every year. And just really encouraging a continued increase in the salaries of teachers. I think one piece of misinformation that has come out this year is that there was the initial plan for teachers to receive a $4,000 salary increase. And the reality of that is that most teachers in South Carolina did not see that $4,000 for two reasons. Number one, really one main reason is that the General Assembly said, okay, we're gonna increase the salary schedule $4,000 at each step, but the local districts are gonna have to make up 30% of that salary increase. And if the district was paying over the minimum, they didn't necessarily have to give that $4,000. So, we only saw the actual $4,000 end up in teacher salaries in a select few of school districts. So I think it's important for people to understand that when you see the headline of teachers to receive a $4,000 salary increase, that's not necessarily what happens when all is said and done. But the piece that I think is superintendent of education that I can really address quickly is the working conditions. A lot of district or state mandates from the Department of Ed have been around probably as long as I've been teaching, or even longer. Looking at those Department of Ed policies and asking the question, is this in the best interest of students? Is this in the best interest of teachers? What is the ultimate purpose of this mandate? And really evaluating it to see, is there still a purpose? Is it still relevant? Is it still valid? If it is, okay, are we meeting it in the best way possible? If not, let's get rid of it or let's adjust it. And then, again, how are we interpreting state law? So those sort of things, I think, and that, is anywhere from, looking at the 30-minute unencumbered time for elementary and middle school to, how teachers can get certified in a more efficient way, to recertification credits, all of that, to even to the new teacher evaluation system, the 4.0, which is a nightmare for teachers and administrators to go through. So all of those things, just looking again at those Department of Ed policies and how we're interpreting state law, and try to roll back as much as possible that is not benefiting students or teachers. I've said for 4 years on the SC for Ed road, if you have happy teachers, you have happy students. And that, to me, I want what is best for students in South Carolina. And a lot of times that is aligned with what is best for teachers in South Carolina. So I think we've got to really focus on, all of those. I've talked about, a friend of mine had to move districts and she missed some in-service training because she hadn't got her TB test. And I asked, I said, is tuberculosis still a thing? Why are we still mandating that test? And if there's a valid reason that we're doing it, let's keep on it. But once you get into a school district, none of us as teachers have to get a TB test every year. So why are we just having to do it that one time? I think most recently, all of us had to sit through hours of back to school videos, bloodborne pathogens and sexual harassment and Title IX. And, why do we have to do that every year? Once you know the material, think like I've seen bloodborne pathogens, 22 times now, and I'm pretty sure I know how to handle blood in a situation. So those sort of time suckers, I think we really can make some headway quickly once I'm in office.
Right, awesome. So the next question, and I'm a mom of a kindergartner, so I'm interested in your answer to this. Will you be able to make kindergarten more play-based?
Oh my gosh, that is one of my issues, is that I've traveled and talked to teachers from elementary school, from child development to middle school, particularly in those early grades, those elementary school grades. What I have continued to see is the fact that the standards are not age appropriate for the children. In particular, what I'm hearing really from the child development, that 4-year-old, 5-year-old kindergarten age, is that we're not doing what is in the best interest of the kids at that developmental age. When you look at human growth in psychology, which every teacher has to take, that kids at that age learn best through play, exploring, navigating the world, sensing it in different ways. And so I've had several people ask, do I believe in universal pre-K? Absolutely, as long as we are setting it up to where it is developmentally appropriate. If we plan on putting children, 4-year-olds, in a desk and forcing them to sit there for hours on end, absolutely not. But if we are setting up classrooms where they have, stations, and they have playtime, and they're able to go on field trips and do all of that, where they're able to explore, engage with their peers, that sort of thing, then I am 100%. I was going to say 110%, and people be like, that doesn't exist. I'm 100% behind that, because that's really what you should be doing with children that age. You should be giving them that freedom to play and explore, and the adult is there to navigate that a little bit, to answer questions, to offer new opportunities of learning. But if we're looking at a model where it's sit and get, absolutely not, because that is not in the best interest of students. Really, that's sort of what is leading to students hating school earlier and earlier.
Awesome. So our next question for you is, how can we keep a cap on class size?
Well, we can encourage the General Assembly to stop putting the waiver in the budget proviso every year. So, there is a state law on the books about class size. It's from the 1970s, I think, so it's already out of date. And the expectations are, unrealistic in today's classroom setting. But since 2008 and the recession, when we lost all of the funding because of the Act 388 change in law and how schools are funded, and teachers were furloughed and let go, the school district said we can't meet these class size limits, and so the state said, okay, well, we'll put a proviso in where you can waive it. You can send a letter, and we will waive the class size restrictions. And sadly, that has been every year since 2008. Even though we are well out of the recession, we are, of course, in a teacher shortage, and so that is something that we have to push first and foremost to remove that proviso that allows districts to waive class sizes. And then secondly, we've got to work on updating that state law. If anybody walks into a classroom today that was in school in the 1970s, and you could even say 80s, it is a very different environment. Students are not sitting in straight rows in their desks. They are, all over. They're working in groups. Teachers are encouraged to do more individualized learning. It's not where the teacher is standing lecturing anymore. That exists very rarely in schools. And so those class sizes need to be smaller, really to help accommodate, the students with that individual time, as well as the workload that type of teaching places on the teacher. And then, of course, we definitely need small class sizes, again, at that K through 2, so we can get students, able to read by the time they reach third grade. The caveat of that, Tameika, is that we're in a teacher shortage, right? So, how do you get that class size down when you don't have enough teachers? And the reality of it is that, again, through the advocacy work with SC for Ed, is that we have met teachers that are like, I would absolutely come back to the classroom if I only had 18 first graders, or I would absolutely come back to the classroom if my class sizes were in the 20 to 25 range. Because not only does that make the teaching more meaningful and effective, but it automatically reduces that workload on teachers. So I think that if we could get to a point where we're enforcing the current state law and even making it to where it's a little bit more stringent, you'd have teachers willing to return to the classroom. But we have got to stop thinking about education like it was in the 20th century, because that education no longer exists for these students and is not what is best for them.
Thank you so much. Again, your answers are so comprehensive, and I'm looking at some of the comments in the chat, and that is what our viewers are saying, that your depth of knowledge is very impressive, and I think that people got to get to the point where they understand that this is critical, and your depth of knowledge actually not only makes you ready for this position on day one, but actually in a position to actually affect the change that people will be voting to say they want to see. So I love your answers.
Thank you for that. I will say that, I have an amazing campaign team, and they're like, you need to get your answers down to 3 minutes or less. And I keep telling them that these issues are not quick ones to fix. Like, there's a lot of gray. I keep saying that education is like a spider web where you've got all of these issues at play. And so it's really difficult to try and get it down into those small answers. And like I said earlier, part of my willingness to run and wanting to run is to educate people on, how not difficult, but how interesting, and, that area gray, it's not black or white. This is not the one size fits all, that we've got to take into all of this into account when we're making these decisions. But I do appreciate that feedback.
Definitely.
I'm
So
sure
another question.
No,
you're good. So another question is, ESP bus raises were 46 cents a day. How do we keep fighting for better for them?
I'm sorry, say that again.
So it said ESP and bus raises were 46 cents a day. How do we keep fighting for better for them?
Absolutely. I realize that I say a lot of things about teachers. I guess I should clarify that and say anybody who interacts with students on a daily basis, right? So if you are, if you're a bus driver, and God bless you for being a bus driver, because I cannot imagine having to navigate and manage students while driving, I say 2 tons. I don't know how much a bus weighs, but a 2-ton moving vehicle on our South Carolina roads, particularly when it's rainy, because people don't slow down when it's raining here in South Carolina. But if you're somebody that works with students on a daily basis, that I don't think there's any of you that is getting paid what you're worth or even close to it. So I think that again is that General Assembly push. The reality is that the General Assembly sets the minimum teacher salary schedule, but it's the local school districts that set, the bus driver. Well, I think that the department does a basic bus driver, and then the school districts can increase it. But the school districts are what does the maintenance, the custodial services, the cafeteria, instructional assistants, all of those other pieces. And again, even though the General Assembly is not setting the teacher salary schedule, they're setting the funding. And so that funding piece again becomes so important, because that's where all of those other positions that students encounter every day, that's where that funding comes from, along with the local funding. And so when we talk about how education in South Carolina has been underfunded, last year it was underfunded $700 per student. And so when you think about $700 times the number of students in your school, Think about all the salary increases you could do with that money. Think about the wraparound services you could do with that money. And so we really have to continue to push our lawmakers to properly fund education. And, we're talking about my specific race, but I think that I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the fact that, we have a governor's race where there are two different two different views on what public education should look like in South Carolina. We've got our entire South Carolina House of Representatives up for election. We really need to look and see who our pro-education candidates are and work to put them in office, because that changes the whole dynamic of us getting the funding that we need and the support that we need for public education in South Carolina. So, my opinion is as long as you are interacting with students on a daily basis, your salary needs to increase.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, so our next question is, how do you envision the role of South Carolina school psychologists in the next 10 years?
That's a great question. I think first and foremost, we don't have enough school psychologists. And, really what their time is hampered with right now is, and I shouldn't say hampered because it's very much a need, but their time is taken up by, writing IEPs, which is an individualized education plan for our special needs students, dealing with those sort of things. What we've seen coming out of COVID really heightened it, but I think, it was already starting to move in that direction, is the struggling mental health of our children. And to me, that's where a school psychologist can be even more effective in just helping students navigate life at whatever age they are. And not only in school, but helping with family situations, those sort of things. I know at my high school, we have an amazing psychologist. He could really use some help though. So I think in funding, that's where we've got to look at that extra funding as well, is we've got to make sure that we're meeting the needs of our students. And again, that, I speak about where this question was specifically about school psychologists, but I also think about our school counselors and their caseload, those sort of things. So again, it goes back to, we've got to stop looking at public education through a 20th century eye and start looking at the needs that our students are bringing into the school and how to effectively address them. The role of school is to help, formulate responsible tax-paying citizens. And if you're a former student of mine, you heard me say that all the time. That's my goal, is for you to be a responsible tax-paying citizen. And so, the schools now do more than just teach academics. We're teaching, and helping students with their physical growth, with their emotional growth, with their mental health growth, and all of that. And so we've got to provide those resources and also give the tools needed to those people that are in those positions to help them be successful and really help our students grow, because we're teaching the whole child these days. When you think about the statistic that a third of our students come from situations of poverty, that brings its own set of issues. The schools, a lot of our schools, we provide two meals of the three that a student would get in a day, and we send backpacks home full of food because they're going to homes that are food insecure. So we've got to really make sure that we're providing all of the resources that our students can have to be successful.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And so the last question on my list, I see that we've got one or two more in the chat. So I'm going to ask this one, and then I'm going to go to our listening audience. So if you have one, please go ahead and make sure that you put that in. So hopefully we'll have enough time to get to everybody. But this one says, do you see a need to curtail the use of devices for teaching? And has the pendulum swung too far?
That is, well, I think it depends on, how they're being used. There has been this move for technology, and of course the one-to-one devicing. I have worked in a school district that has been that way for years. And, I have sort of mixed feelings about it. I was always the teacher that, use the technology when it was helpful for students, but if it was just a matter of me having to use it because it was the technology, it didn't really work that way. Tamika, I also really believe that it is age dependent, right? There's a lot of gross motor skills that particularly our young students need that they don't necessarily get on a tablet or a laptop. They need to be able to grasp their pencil, right? That's not only learning to write, but that's a gross motor skill of the brain going to the hand to hold and grip. And so, again, like with a lot of these questions, it's got to be what's developmentally appropriate. At the high school level, it's very different. You're doing a lot of research. You're doing a lot of group projects in classes, and so the technology tools help with that and make it a lot easier, in terms of research and all of that. So I really think that it's looking at what is developmentally appropriate for the age of the child. I think that the one advantage of technology, particularly with COVID, and, we're sort of in the world now where we have to sort of expect, hopefully not even though we're still in COVID, but another global pandemic that shut us down as much as it did. But we think about inclement weather days, right? And so that access to technology is really, going to be helpful in those situations. But again, and I'm stepping out of the purvey of the superintendent of education, we've got to make sure that as a state, we have the broadband internet access across the state for students to have access to the technology. Honestly, what I have seen that has been most detrimental to students growing and learning is, I call it now a box of knowledge, but the social media piece on that. And I go back to speaking about, social and emotional and mental health. Social media is really, it's a beast that is really hurting our kids. And so, when I think about technology, the tools that teachers are using in schools are not nearly as detrimental as access to the social media that kids have these days. I was saying to my students the other day that I'm so grateful that I grew up in a time where social media did not exist, except for unless you were literally calling on a telephone, right? And so, I think that when we talk about the detriment of technology, we shouldn't be looking at it as, oh, it's the school's fault, but looking at this whole piece of, social media and access to information that is not age appropriate for students.
That's great. Let me ask a follow-up question before I get to this last question that's in the chat, and then we close up with some final thoughts and to-dos, and of course how people can help and support the campaign moving forward in the next, I think, 68 days. Is it something like that?
Something like that.
But there continues to be, this is my editorial word, not yours, but a false narrative. But whatever you want to call it, there's a parents versus teachers versus government or whatever. And of course, I don't believe that. And I do think that everyone, of course, wants parents to be involved. Some more involved than they already are. A lot of that is on the local level, but I understand that the way some of these things are happening, the narrative is happening on a state level to change state law or anything else because of that. And so, as superintendent of education, what is your opinion regarding the involvement of parents in their child's education? And where do you think the State Department has a role in helping that conversation along?
Tameika, that's a really great question. And I appreciate that you use the term false narrative. Education is a partnership, right? I remember the story, it takes a village to raise a child. And that could not be more true than in educating a student. I think that, as teachers, we welcome parent involvement. We welcome family involvement. To the extent that it supports what we're trying to accomplish with the student. I think that parent or that teachers get frustrated when it's seen as sort of helicoptering, because, and particularly at the high school level, because these students are going to be on their own in 4 years or less. And so, the role of education and the role of parenting is the same end, right? To provide them the ability to be independent, when they graduate through high school. And so that I can definitely tell you, though, that through my 22 years of educating, the how parents react has changed. And I honestly don't know why. I think part of it has been the narrative it's all the teacher's fault. It's the teacher's responsibility. But I can remember calling home, because it was kind of before email. Email was just becoming a thing. But calling home and saying, I'm having some trouble with little Johnny doing his work, and the parent would respond, "Oh, it'll be taken care of tonight." And now I hesitate to honestly, and I'm being completely honest here. Sometimes I hesitate to call home, because the response is, "Well, what are you doing to make Johnny do his work?" And at the high school level, that's not the role of the teacher, right? Johnny needs to be taking the responsibility on himself. And I'm sorry if I'm picking on somebody named Johnny, but anyway. But I think that that's the piece, is that teachers want the help and support from parents, and parents, I hope, appreciate the support from teachers and holding their students accountable and helping teach them in a different way, right? We're all teachers. Parents are part of that as well. And just having that partnership. And then at the point of, the idea that the student is also responsible for his or her learning. And when they're young, the adults are much more responsible for that. But as they matriculate up through K through 12, more and more of the responsibility needs to fall onto the student. And the parent is there as a support, and the teacher is there as a support. But ultimately, it's the student's responsibility to be successful. And I think that's sort of where we struggle, is making sure that student is taking on the responsibility, and honestly, that we're allowing them to fail while they're in K through 12 and they can recover. That's what we're seeing a lot of, is we're not allowing kids to fail when there's a chance for them to recover and fail softly, if that makes any sense. And so what's happening is they're getting, to college, or they're getting out of college, and they're failing for the first time. And it really, is destroying some of them. And so I think it's always going to be a partnership. We've got to work together. And I think the role of the Department of Education, and the superintendent, is to really help facilitate those opportunities. A lot of times, as I'm driving home from work or to work, people are going to be like, "Oh my gosh, you're such a loser because you're always thinking about this," is how I can use that role of superintendent ed to help not only teachers and students, but our community understand education. And, I was like, maybe I'll start doing a podcast and bring in, parents to talk about parenting issues, and sit down and talk about how parents navigate through the process. And then I'll bring in teachers, and then I'll bring in students, just to have those sort of open conversations. Because here's the thing, parenting, and I say this, not having my own biological children, it is the hardest job out there. It is hands down the hardest job that exists today. And I tell parents, if you think it's easy, you're not doing it right, because it is so hard, because you are constantly torn between wanting to love and protect and do all you can for your child, to pushing them out and forcing, having to sit back and watch them learn and screw up and go out in the world. And that is really hard. To a certain extent, that makes teaching the next hardest job, because you are with those students, hours of the day, you're protective of them. And so, recognizing how hard these jobs are, I think helps make us, sort of similar in the outcomes, because we all want our children to be successful. And so that was a really long-winded answer to that. I'm sorry.
Again, very complete. And the chat has just lit up with a bunch of questions. And unfortunately, I don't think we have time for all of these. I do see a couple that maybe you have just jumped in, and so some of these were answered before. I know somebody asked your position on standardized testing, and so please, if you are just now joining us, go back and watch the replay. Because Lisa has had a very comprehensive answer to a lot of these questions, and I know that your questions will get answered. I know we had a couple more that may not have been answered here, but the amazing Emily Mayer is on, and she said that she will write down these questions and make sure she adds them. Because there will be lots of more opportunities for you to hear Lisa. Lisa is doing a virtual town hall. I have seen the schedule. If you've not, look back on the Lisa Ellis for SC Facebook page, and there's a schedule of her town halls and where she'll be and how you can meet her. And so I really want to encourage you to do that. I also want to encourage you to share this video. If you share it on your page, that is how we're going to get more people. I see Javar Juarez on here, and he talked about his network of 50,000 people, and he's going to make sure he's sharing this. Thank you for that. I think if we all do that, more people will touch more people. The issue in South Carolina isn't that we don't have the folks who believe in public education and want good candidates. It's just that they may not be in a situation or an area where they're getting the information or they feel engaged. And so the way we get more people engaged is that we engage them. So I hope that you do that. And so, Lisa, let me ask the last question that Lisa Izzo asked. How can people get involved with your campaign? So in a few minutes, just let everybody know what support do you need, and how can people get involved in the campaign? How can they support you to make sure that you are our next superintendent for education?
Thank you so much for asking that. I think it's important for people to understand, because this is evidently very unusual, is that I'm still working full time. I'm still teaching and in the schools. And so my time is very limited from traditional campaign things. And so it would be really helpful if, what our goal with the campaign is try to connect with as many voters as possible, and also trying to register as many voters as possible to vote. And so we're doing that through what they call phone banking. So calling people, text banking, texting people, the traditional snail mail of writing postcards, which, I love getting fun mail like that. So I think that that's a great way to do it. And so if you're willing to help in any of those ways, we're hoping when it cools down a little bit to go out and start canvassing, going door to door and talking to people and voters. And so those are ways to get involved. And like Tameika said, if you go to lisaforsc.com, also campaigns are way more expensive than I ever thought that they were. So if you have a couple dollars here and there to throw at the campaign to pay for the postcards and pay for the stamps and pay for the yard signs and pay for the text banking and all of that, that would be really helpful as well. Most importantly, though, start having conversations with your circle of influence. Start talking to your neighbors, start talking to your bunco group, start talking to your paint and pour group. Just go and talk to people at church, because we really have the opportunity to make big changes in South Carolina in public education, and we can only do that by talking to each other and having those conversations about how important public education is in South Carolina right now.
Well, thank you. And so I thank you for offering yourself as a candidate. I thank you for what you have done over the last 20-something years to pour into our young people and produce great citizens for this state and this country and this actually for this world. Because I always say we're not competing just with other states now. We're competing on a global level. And that's why we need really great people to understand the importance of our public education system. And then I want to thank all of you for tuning in tonight to this town hall. I appreciate it. The chat was on fire. I'm sorry if we didn't get to every single question, but that's a reason for you to come back. That's a reason for you to stay engaged with the campaign so that you can get your questions answered. But I want to also make a plea to folks to participate. As someone who served in office for almost 20 years and is really, just a year ago coming off a huge campaign, I can't stress to you how important resources are. money resources, time resources. And so I please encourage, no matter what it is that you can give, every dollar adds up. So don't think that I can't give big money, so I'm not going to give anything. You can give $5, $10, $25. You can put $5 on a recurring debit for the next couple weeks, and actually give a couple hundred. And so please donate, because that's the only way that we're going to get the word out. It's one thing to have a good candidate, but we can have all the great candidates in the world, but if they don't have the resources to get touch voters and get their message out, then we get more of the same. And so I encourage you to donate. I also encourage you to volunteer, whether it is from the safety of your own home, as she mentioned, text banking, phone calling, or writing postcards, or if you want to come out and engage with people. I know the campaign needs volunteers, so please volunteer. It could be a great girls' night out for you and your friends, or a boys' night out, or whatever. Bring your friends along and bring people to the campaign. And then lastly, please, please, please share the word, spread the word. For you, those of you who watched tonight, we know that you're going to vote. We know that you're engaged because you watched this last hour. Not everybody does that. People are, picking up kids. I mean, you probably saw me texting. I have people picking up kids and feeding my kids while I'm here with you guys. So people have busy lives. We get it. So it's no criticism for folks who aren't able to engage. But if you are somebody that they know, love, and trust, and you say, hey, we've got a great candidate running for superintendent of education, I need you to come and listen to her. I need you to come vote for her. I need you to come volunteer for her. They will do that. And so please share the message. Because it's kind of the whole old age adage of teachers, each one teach one. We're doing the same thing. Each one reach one. We need to all reach some folks and make sure that they get to the polls on November 5th. So with that said, thank you all for tuning in. We appreciate your support. We appreciate the kind words. And then let's do this thing. We have less than 70 days to Election Day. And so we need all hands on deck to make sure that Lisa Ellis is our next superintendent of education. So good night, God bless, and thank you all so much.